Greetings, gentle viewers. I am George from Ireland, in front of London's most famous statue that isn't. Behind me you won't see a statue of William, the Duke of Cumberland. You'll only see the plinth with the inscription to him. So he is a largely forgotten figure in history these days, but briefly he was perceived as the hero of the hour, the saviour of the United Kingdom. So he was born in 1721, one of the youngest sons of King George II. Of course, there were Hanoverians, and William the Duke of Cumberland was amongst the first generation to be born here in the United Kingdom of the Hanoverians. His grandfather, George I, came over from Hanover in 1714 and spoke limited English, and regarded Hanover as home, went back there as much as possible. His father, George II, was an adolescent when they came over, and though he did master English, he perhaps never completely adapted to this country. So by William Duke of Cumberland's generation, it was different. So his eldest brother was Frederick. I remember the eldest son of the monarch gets the title Prince of Wales, as in Prince Charles is Prince of Wales these days, the Crown Prince. And during his lifetime, the war of Austrian succession was going on in the 1740s, and so who was going to take over the throne of the Austrian Empire or the Holy Roman Empire? The two were largely coterminous, which is most of Central Europe, which was quite a few of the German states. There were 360 German states at the time, some of them fully independent, some of them semi-independent, and the Holy Roman Empire included, say, southern Poland, what's now Slovakia, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, Transylvania, Ruthenia, well, that's not a country now, Slovenia, a bit of Croatia, and on and on. So it was one of the predominant Catholic powers, the other one being France, and when the emperor had only a daughter, Maria Theresa, could she inherit under his pragmatic sanction? He said that she could. That was breaking the Salic law about succession being only through the male line and so forth. And she married Charles of Lorraine, or Lothringen in German. That's why the surname of the Austrian imperial house, Habsburg, became Habsburg-Lothringen. The fact that people seem to overlook ever since. Because I had a colleague who was of this family, and his surname was Habsburg-Lothringen, but we generally just call them Habsburg. He didn't have the lip, though. Anyway, so France was one of the United Kingdom's main enemies then, and they both were imperial powers. They both owned land in North America, various islands in the Caribbean, some ports on the coast of Africa, some ports on India's littoral as well. And so they were rivals for mastery of the seas and oceans, as well as these valuable trade routes in various commodities like sugar, tobacco, and so forth. So you may know about the Glorious Revolution, so-called, of 1688, but that's obviously a very pejorative name to call it. Let's just call it the 1688 Revolution, when James II fled this country and his son-in-law, William III, took over. His son-in-law also being his nephew, William III, stadtholder of the Netherlands, or William III, we often call him William of Orange. So William of Orange being married to Mary, as in daughter of James II. Anyway, they had no children, and then Mary's sister Anne ruled for some years. You may have seen the recent film about her. She died in 1714, and she was married to Prince George of Denmark. You may have heard of that trumpet voluntary by Jeremiah Clarke, who was the organist of St. Paul's in the 18th century, the Prince of Denmark's March. It was famously played at Princess Anna's wedding. Dun 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 dun. I shall spare you my humming. But anyway, so they had several children, none of whom made it. One of them, whom was, try not to be cruel, of very limited intellectual capacity, died as an adolescent. Anyway, so who was the throne to go to? They went to the Hanoverians, the nearest Protestant relatives they had, skipping over 58 Roman Catholics who were higher up the line of succession, because the Act of Settlement had prohibited those who were of the Catholic faith from inheriting the crown. So it proved that obviously the crown was in the gift of Parliament. I suppose it had been established through the English Civil War, and perhaps there were earlier things, even the Insanity Act under Henry VI. But coming back to this, so What about James II? He fled because his infant son was going to be born, and his son was known as the Old Pretender, but it's partly, as in the Spanish verb pretender, to claim. But he spent most of his life in Italy then, and the Catholic countries of Europe backed him up. Spain, France, the Italian states, the Papal states. Remembering the Pope was a serious political leader at the time, ruled the Papal states, plural, in central Italy, had a legate, that's a cardinal, he sent to rule the various ones like Ferrara and Bologna, had his pontifical army and pontifical navy. But anyway, so the Pretender, he attempted to stage a comeback in Scotland, landing on the west coast of Scotland, about 1715, fighting the inconclusive Battle of Sheriff Moor. He had French support, came back with Spanish support a few years later, and didn't get very far from Kyle of Lochalsh. But anyway, his son was Charles Edward Stuart, born in Rome, if memory serves, in 1720, just a year after William Duke of Cumberland, his nemesis. So he was known as the Young Pretender, Charles Edward Stuart, Stuart being the surname. But he was known in Scotland later as Bonnie Prince Charlie. So the Jacobite cause was still alive here in England. It was quite a minor thing. Remember, there were two political parties at the time, Whigs and Tories, entirely informal. There was no, they didn't officially exist, they were not banned, but there was no membership list, there was no manifesto, there was no official leader. They were things that people just said, I belong to this side or that side. Anyway, so the Whigs were obviously very Hanoverian, the Tories mostly Hanoverian, and a few of them were of Jacobite sympathies, and they had songs about when the king enjoys its own again, the Jacobites would sing. I can't remember how it goes now. Shall Britons hug the chain that we deny? I can't remember the earlier bits to it. It'll come to me sometime. But anyway, so Charles Edward Stuart was eager to reclaim what he regarded as his inheritance. His father was still alive, and so the French support, okay, War of Austrian Succession is going on, the time was ripe. So King Louis XV, he backed Charles Edward Stuart, sent him some warships and a few French officers to land on the west coast of Scotland in July 1745, the men of Moydart, and raised his standard, asked the clans to gather. So Jacobitism was much stronger in Scotland than it was in England. Remember, in England, almost everybody here was a Protestant, and the key thing about the Jacobite dynasty is they were Catholics, and that was anathema. Anti-Catholic bigotry was quite widespread here. Of course, in Ireland, a high majority of us were Catholics. He might have been better off landing in Ireland, where, of course, his grandfather, James II, had made his last stand, with not very much commitment, though. So he landed in Scotland, and some of the Highland clans rallied to him. Obviously, the majority of people in Scotland were Church of Scotland, Protestant. A few people were Episcopalian. Episcopalian, is it Protestant, is it not? Well, it's certainly not Roman Catholic. The Pope is not the head of their church. It's kind of a carbon copy of the Church of England, except in Scotland. Episcopalian takes its name from episcopus, as in bishop in ancient Greek. They had bishops in their church and archbishops. Presbyterians do not. The Church of Scotland's got a Presbyterian church structure, as in presbyteros, elder in ancient Greek. They don't have bishops and archbishops. That's too like Roman Catholicism. So the Episcopalians were a minority, perhaps 10% of the Scots population, and some of them were Jacobites and some of them were not. And then there obviously were Catholics in Scotland. It's difficult to estimate, but perhaps 10%. So, I mean, practically every Catholic in Scotland would be a Jacobite, some of the Episcopalians, and a few of the Church of Scotland people, even though they're the majority. What? A Protestant would fight for a Catholic king? Yeah, some did, just like a Catholic would fight for a Protestant king, and so on. Anyway, so I shan't go through the whole campaign, but he rapidly outmaneuvered Sir John Cope, got to Edinburgh, and held court in Holyrood House for several weeks. Sir John Cope sailed to meet him and won the Battle of Preston Pans by a surprise night attack, crossing a supposedly impassable marsh with the help of a local guide who knew a way across it, and then singing the song, Are You Walking, Johnny Cope? But walking meaning waking. Are you awake, Sir John Cope? Because they attacked whilst he was slumbering. Anyhow, so he came down here into England, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and he was hoping he'd get lots of support. He'd been led to believe that the English were just bursting to be free of these Hanoverian tyrants, and would wear the white cockade. A white cockade in your hat was a symbol that you were a Jacobite. Remember, the Jacobites had a ragtag army, no uniform, mostly just carrying a claymore, as in a big sword, a few of them having pistols, and very few of them having muskets. So these Highland clans were often fighting each other and just cattle rustling. I know we seem to romanticize armed robbery, but that's what it was. And so some of them got here, got some cattle, and just went home. The army just melted away. got down to Derby, and he was finally persuaded he couldn't go any further, because obviously the British Army was here. Remember, they were fighting in mainland Europe, mainly what's now Belgium, and the British Army panicked. Obviously, it was top priority, defending the homeland, and brought back more and more regiments. So let me see, Bonnie Prince Charlie's military commander was Lord George Murray, and by some forced marches and some very nifty manoeuvring, he'd managed to keep out of the clutches of the British Army, which was starting to outnumber him 3-1, and obviously was much better equipped. Every man had a musket, they had plenty of cannon, the Jacobites had almost none, and the Jacobite army was dwindling by the day. So there was a council of war, and Bonnie Prince Charlie had been lying to his men all the time, saying huge French reinforcements were going to land, and they never ever materialized. And they were only about 120 miles from London, and they wouldn't push on. The Prime Minister at the time was Henry Pelham, a Whig, and he was not gallant at the best of times, and he was really jittery. If the Jacobites had marched onto London, almost certainly they would have been heavily defeated, because they were hugely outnumbered, they were deep inside hostile territory. Retreat would have been very difficult. So held a council of war, and all but Bonnie Prince Charlie voted that they must retreat to Scotland. So finally, even though he believed in the divine right of kings, he submitted to the will of the majority, and they marched back to Scotland. Fast forward to April 1746, when they decided to fight at the Battle of Culloden. So the government army, that's the British army, fighting for the Hanoverians, they landed near Nairn, and so the British army troops who got up there to Scotland were commanded by him, William, the Duke of Cumberland. And the Jacobites attempted a night attack, which had served them so well at the Battle of Preston Pans the previous September. And so they're obviously trying to walk in the pitch dark, no candles, that would alert the enemy, in silence, and find the enemy several miles away. And it didn't work. And Bonnie Prince Charles also was trying to lead the march from the rear. So dawn broke, and they hadn't got to enemy lines. Of course, you advance very slowly in the dark, because you can't see where you're going. And they had not eaten or slept. And they formed up from the plains, and obviously the Duke of Cumberland had his artillery wreak devastation on the Jacobite lines, who were somewhat outnumbered. And the Jacobites had one fantastic tactic, this ferocious Highland charge. Trouble was, it was the only thing they had, because once they engaged the enemy, they just weren't up for obeying orders. They didn't have drummers or buglers to signal to go this way and that, because obviously before radios, how are you going to signal to the troops to retreat, advance, form a square or something? It had to be by that in the din of battle. So it all went wrong for them, and they suffered very heavy casualties. Now, one of the controversial things about the Duke of Cumberland is he'd drawn up this false order. He'd hoaxed an order he supposed he had captured from the Jacobites, saying to give no quarter, all Hanoverian troops must be put to death because they're traitors. Obviously, Bonnie Prince Charlie, his father is the rightful King of Scots, as well as King of England, King of Ireland, so kill them all. And so therefore the Duke of Cumberland said these people are not soldiers, they're traitors, they're fighting for a pretender, and they're obviously fighting for the French. And so that was that. So the battle was fought, and many wounded Jacobites were put to death, and they fled the battlefield. They suffered very heavy casualties. If wounded men were found being sheltered by family some distance away, the wounded man was usually executed. They did take some prisoners, who were then sent to the Caribbean to live out their lives in servitude. So that was that. Bonnie Prince Charlie, he escaped to the Hebrides. You may know the Over the Sea to Sky by, oh God, who's that German composer? I've forgotten his name. It'll come to me. The one who, Mendelssohn. The Hebrides Overture, and Flora MacDonald, who helped him escape. Ironically, she then married a British Army officer. So Bonnie Prince Charlie, he got back to France. At the end of the war, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, that's Aachen to you and me. One of the conditions of the United Kingdom was that he must be expelled from France, as he duly was. He lived out the rest of his life in Rome. He married a Scots noblewoman. He had no children with her. He had a daughter with his mistress, and he abandoned his mistress and his daughter, Clementina. But later, he was a sad old alcoholic. His daughter found him, forgave him, despite him having left her destitute, and nursed him in his declining years. He died just before the French Revolution. So the news broke in London a couple of weeks after the Battle of Culloden that the Hanoverian forces had triumphed. They had scored a smashing victory, and obviously he wreaked vengeance on those who'd been Jacobites. Famously, there was Lord Lovat, who was about 80 years old. He'd allowed Bonnie Prince Charlie to stay in his house. Lord Lovat was brought down here, tried for treason, and executed. You may know it's Pierre Brachard, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. There's a virtuoso bagpipe tune, which is a dirge for him when people are in mourning, but the title still survives. His gentlemanly Highland sense of decency forfended turning away someone seeking shelter, and he paid with his life for that code of honour. So many houses were burnt down. I'm not sure if civilians were killed, I'm not aware of it. And then Marshal Wade was up there, and they banned various things to make sure that the Jacobites wouldn't come back. Well, it certainly worked. There was never any attempt at recrudescence of Jacobitism ever. And incidentally, if you're taking the loyal oath in this country, as in the Queen or the King, if there is a king, you shouldn't have any water on the table, because it'd be the king over the water, as into the Jacobites. Well, so as I say, he had no legitimate children. Bonnie Prince Charlie, his younger brother Henry, become a cardinal, and Bonnie Prince Charlie's very miffed at that. So Bonnie Prince Charlie became King Charles III, according to himself. When he died, his brother supposedly became Henry IX, and then the line died out. Now, there was a Belgian bloke who emerged in about 1991, a descendant of Bonnie Prince Charlie's mistress, and he claimed to be the rightful King of Scots, but nobody took that remotely seriously. This did manage to secure him a princely position as a shop assistant at an Edinburgh tartan shop. He was a minor figure in the media in the early 90s. So the Duke of Cumberland, he returned here to a hero's welcome, and Georg Friedrich Handel was the talk of the town back then, this German composer who'd come over with the Hanoverians, and he wrote an opera, Judas Maccabeus, as in the biblical figure. You may have heard of the Book of Maccabees, when they resisted, I can't remember, was it the Greeks? But Handel composed an ode to the Duke of Cumberland, with music to go with it. See the conquering hero comes, sound the trumpet, beat the drum, and so on. The tune was later used for that, what is it? Thine be the glory, living conquering son, endless is the victory, thou o'er death hast won. So the Whig Party, they hailed him as the man who had rescued the country from the foul clutches of these wicked Romanists, the Jacobites, who were imposters to the throne, trying to usurp it from the rightful Hanoverians and extinguish parliamentary liberty. But the Tory party was not so keen on him. They liked to emphasise the crimes his men had supposedly committed, and he felt that he was very hard done by. He was given a mission, he had accomplished that mission, and it was a resounding success. There was no question about the victory. It was just an ordinary victory. He had absolutely smashed the enemy and suffered very few casualties himself, such that the problem never ever resurrected itself, so the curse was broken. Alright, so that's the Duke of Cumberland, who died a relatively young man, at the age of 46 if memory serves. I don't know why on earth his equestrian statue isn't here.